I'm David Debato, and you've just entered the No Delusion Zone. Welcome to this edition of the No Delusion Zone and my guest, Davit Zedeslashvili. Davit is a lawyer and professor at the University of Georgia School of Law in Tbilisi, where he teaches courses in constitutional law theory, focusing on the abuse of constitutionalism and the rule of law under illiberal and authoritarian regimes. His most recent article is titled Stalinism's Return Threatens Georgia's Path to Europe. Davit Zedeslashvili, welcome to the No Delusion Zone.
Thank you for inviting me, David.
My pleasure, my pleasure. Davit, I'd like to open our discussion with just a very brief history of Georgia's fairly recent efforts to join the greater European community after declaring independence in 1991. Could you briefly walk us through some of the significant events that occurred since Georgian independence throughout the 1990s, through the Rose Revolution in 2003, the Russian invasion of 2008, and of course, on to the current time and the new foreign agent law?
I will try to squeeze it in a really brief manner, just to make also sense of what's happening now. So the Georgia declared its independence from the Soviet Union following a referendum in 1991. That was in March 1991, before the breakup of the Soviet Union. Eventually, Georgia was recognized as a sovereign state only in 1992, once the Soviet Union was already extinct, ceased to exist as a subject of international law. So in the meantime, there was a coup d'état at the end of 1991 and beginning of 1992. That was very much facilitated by the remnants of the Russian troops and the Russian military intelligence unit still present in Georgia, because the Russian troops remained in Georgia until 2007, and they still remain in parts of Georgia that is occupied, still occupied by Russia following the 2008 war. So the coup d'etat basically followed the refusal of the then president, democratically elected president, a former dissident of the Soviet rule, President Gamsahurdia. He refused to sign the founding treaty of the Commonwealth of Independent States. That was sort of a successor format of the Soviet Union, an attempt of Moscow to leave those former Soviet republics, excluding the Baltic states, under its sphere of influence. So basically, Gamsahurdia was toppled, the first president, following the coup d'etat. And there was a brief rule of the warlords who toppled Gamsahurdia, and then they invited the former Soviet foreign minister Eduard Shevardnadze, who was foreign minister under Gorbachev, and who negotiated basically all basic agreements of the Soviet Union and the President Reagan and then Bush, including the fall of the Berlin Wall and all those major events. So Shevardnadze had this great international prominence, but he was, before, in the 70s and 80s, he was the head of the Soviet Georgia, head of the Communist Party in the Soviet Georgia. So how Shevardnadze got back to power? Because he had the elites aligned with him, and we have to really consider who were the elites after the breakup of the Soviet Union in Georgia. And the elites were basically the clients of the Soviet regime, engineered by the Soviet regime after the careful social engineering efforts, and who were actually very much aligned attuned to the Russian domination, and also they were accustomed to a powerful patron like Shevardnadze. Because Shevardnadze, when he came back to Georgia, it was, there was this in between also, the Russia instigated this ethnic conflict in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. There was a war there, internal conflict there. And Shevardnadze, had to build from the scratch the institutions of the state. And he succeeded to a certain extent because he had the he had this support from the elites, and also he got some conditional support from Russia because he agreed and made Georgia belatedly member of the Commonwealth of Independent States. So the reason why Gamsakhudia was toppled, Shevardnadze actually followed that request from Russia, and then Georgia became the member of Commonwealth of Independent States. Georgia only left that organization following the 2008 war with Russia. So we have Shevardnadze in power in the first years of his rule. Shevardnadze not only had to agree to Moscow, to Yeltsin, and it's very significant that Yeltsin is regarded somehow as less imperialistic of the Russia's president, but towards Georgia he was as imperialist as anyone else, because everything what I'm recalling now was happening under Yeltsin. So during Yeltsin, Shevardnadze in 1992 and 1993, up to 1995, when Georgia's constitution was adopted, he was actually forced to appoint as ministers of security, internal affairs, and defense all Russian assets, basically generals of the former Russian KGB, Russian armed forces. Those people were
Davit, I don't know if you can hear me, but we have lost your signal. So if you can try to rejoin, we will hold on. Go ahead. I lost you for a few moments. Continue.
Yeah. So Giorgadze, who actually made a failed assassination attempt of Shevardnadze in 1995, right after the adoption of Georgia's 1995 constitution. Shevardnadze's car was blown up, but he survived miraculously, And following that, Shevardnadze actually tried to remember his, old techniques of balancing and maneuvering and everything, and also, exploiting his ties he had in the West. And he tried to reorient from the Russian sphere of influence, and he initiated, for example, right in 2002, following the 9/11 terrorist attacks, we had actually a very very problematic strip in Georgian mountains because they were bordering to Chechnya, and there were some Chechen rebels across there, and the Russians were making threats of invading that strip in order to bring, order or whatever. And at that time, the United States has started the first major project with Georgia's armed forces. It was basically some training, skills, and equipment for the counter-terrorist operations. But that actually outgrown into a bigger engagement that later developed in Georgia's forces participation in the operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, and all those NATO-led operations. So basically, Shevardnadze made this turn, but the turn was only completed by the next president, Mikhail Saakashvili. Saakashvili was a Western-educated guy who was under Shevardnadze. He was in Shevardnadze's government, and in 2003, then there was this parliamentary election. Shevardnadze was old. He was the leader of that patronalist system, which he presided over. And in patronal regimes, you have the problem of succession. Everyone, the elites also, and everyone outside, including Russia, United States, everyone was concerned who would succeed Shevardnadze. So there was a clear succession problem, and his state was, failed. His state institutions were very weak, very corrupt. The Georgian economy was backwards. There was a high poverty. There was an exhaustion, with the regime and everything. So that's how this popular revolution, Rose Revolution, happened in 2003. There was an energetic leader, a charismatic leader, Mikhail Saakashvili, who had this clear program of modernization and westernization of Georgia. And he seemed, and everyone else, he rode the tide of this popular discontent, and he emerged as a clear successor who could lead Georgia. So, and who could amass a plebiscitary popular legitimacy. He was following the revolution. He was elected by 96%. And then there was the Saakashvili's, push. He tried in the beginning to settle things with Russia. He met Putin several times. What actually he later recalls is that the first thing Putin asked from him is to keep the security personnel who worked for Putin in power and in government. Saakashvili fired those people, and he pushed to the other way. So there was this growing rift, that the pivot from the Georgian leadership to finally go to the West, and that of course did not fit into Putin's ambitions. But at that time, no one in the West, even following his Munich speech, Munich Security Conference speech in 2007, then his resurgent imperialism and the getting back of his imperial project was clearly outlined in front of the Western audiences. There was a clear inability and unwillingness even to believe in that Putin is really into that. He's really pursuing that sort of an imperialist project. No one would like to believe that, And then we have the 2008 war and war of aggression against Georgia. And even at that time, Putin could not take Tbilisi, but he occupied those parts of Georgian territories he had before conclusively. And then he stated that he simply changed the means of engagement in a spirit of the hybrid warfare. Yeah, he said that, okay, I've concluded the military operation here, but I'm not done with Georgia. And then in his several speeches following 2008, he was hinting what kind of approach he would pursue in Georgia. What kind of approach would his hybrid warfare would take? He would say that Georgian people would actually answer to Saakashvili and would hold him account for what he did in 2008. So that was clearly a hint that he would go on to meddle into Georgia's internal politics and to influence the outcome this way. So, and here we come to the 2012, where Saakashvili's second presidential term is about to expire, and we have this parliamentary election. Before that, there is a change of constitution, and it seems that Saakashvili has rewritten the constitution to move from the presidential system to a parliamentary, towards a more parliamentary system, in order to ensure that there is no issue of succession, and he continues to govern as a president. But still, you know, he tried that in 2012 to keep this facade that, you know, I'm not a successor. He was ambivalent whether he would stay as a prime minister. You know, that also played a role. But then Bidzina Ivanishvili emerged, who was a guy who enriched himself in Russia, who was very secretive, and who stayed in Georgia into shadows. He supported for a while even Saakashvili and his government, you know, financed many of his projects and stuff like this. But he was until then publicly unknown, and he emerges from the shadows, announces that he's here to run for the democratic change, to unseat Saakashvili, to bring the democratic development, to bring the normalization with Russia. Then he ran on the platform that in foreign policy terms was like two pillars. We should normalize with Russia. We should not irritate Russia like Saakashvili does. And we should try to remove the issue of Georgia as an object of disagreement between the West and Russia. So basically at that time, this, you know, for many, it rang like an alarm that it is like a secret rapprochement towards Russia. But for many, it seemed like a sensible policy to pursue, considering that U.S. and U.S. administration was at that time pursuing a policy of reset with Russia, a re-engagement, and that was a similar policy with the European powers too. And the European powers were somehow being fed up with, you know, combative stance of Saakashvili and saying that, no, Putin is in his imperialist project and we should be hardline and everything. You know, it was not following their policies. They were really irritated with that. So at that time, Ivanishvili's policy proposals that, you know, I'm taking Georgia away from the disagreements. And I try to balance between, you know, Russia and the West, and not totally going under Russian influence, and staying somehow pursuing all this European integration for Georgia. That was the somehow nicely enveloped the Georgian dream, basically what he sold to Georgians and to the West, that you can have your cake and eat it, right? You can live in prosperity and have your Western integration at the same time, not irritating Russia. And Russia would be fine with that. It was, considering the entire trajectory that followed, it was even at that time, I was highly skeptical, for example, and there were many people who were highly skeptical that would materialize. But at that time, that version of Georgian dream turned out to be very attractive for many people, and that's how Ivanishvili wins the elections. Saakashvili is afraid of the isolation from the West. If he does electoral tricks or somehow refuses to accept the transfer of power as a result of election. So the first in the Georgian history peaceful electoral transfer of power happens in 2012, and Ivanishvili gains access to the political branches. So it's a semi-parliamentary system by then. So it means that if you control the majority of the legislature, you control the government. You have the prime ministerial office. So you have the control of the political branches, and he slowly starts, state capture and consolidation and personalization of power around himself. So that's the story that starts in 2012, and also the gradual demolishing of the infrastructure of Georgia's relations with the Western powers, and gradual reorientation. Getting back under the Russian umbrella, including the economic dependence, growing economic and trade ties and dependence on the Russia. So, but that's a long time in the making. Yeah, that's an entire decade. He does it slowly, sometimes stealthily, and many times hidden from the public eyes and scrutiny. It's a story of very step-by-step iterative playbook. What internally, basically, he does this regular stuff, what the similar illiberal leaders are doing in making these illiberal democracies, like Orban in Hungary, Erdogan in Turkey, or elsewhere, or even Putin himself, what Putin did in early 2000, that's a similar playbook. So there are so many similarities. If we go into the details, we see that, you see the clearly recognizable patterns and the instruments and the outcomes, everything. So yeah, that's quite a long overview how we come here. Hopefully it makes sense, because I tried to make it hold also for the listener who is not necessarily familiar with the context, but I may overly emphasized some of the issues and left out some. So let's try to answer all the holes that may remain. Yeah.
No, you did a great job, and I'm going to circle back to some specifics on what you said, and of course get to your article very soon. But I want to ask at this point, after what you just said, in your opinion, what's the mood in Georgia right now? For example, I just interviewed a member of the Slovak parliament the same day that Robert Fico had the assassination attempt on his life. And the mood there is very grim, a very unstable situation, possibly bordering on a civil war. Has the passage of the foreign agent law caused a similar unrest in Georgia, in your opinion?
Yeah, the situation here remains tense, and there is a growing realization that yes, what the people were sold as a Georgian dream is actually a Russian Stalinist nightmare, and that nightmare is now exposed. It's exposed. It's exposed to the end. You know, it's exposed to the slimmest detail by its leader, Mr. Ivanishvili, when he made the speech of April 29th, in front of these vast employees of the public services and other people who are dependent on the regime. And he basically announced this comprehensive anti-Western manifesto filled with conspiracy theories like the global party of war, trying to undermine Georgian sovereignty, Georgia's traditional values, whatever. And he is the one who is the guarantor of that sovereignty. So he fights for that, you know, the standard stuff. And for that, he has designated the enemies within. The enemy within is the civil society, opponents of the regime, here he announced the authoritarian consolidation and also mass repressions. He said in a very, decisive and in a very open threat to violence, which has since materialized, because before that, this regime was sort of an illiberal regime, still running of the plebiscitarian endorsement of the relative majorities. There was still some democracy in. And it resorted to repression and violence, but the paradigm was different. The paradigm of that repression and violence was a targeted legal repression. Only some political opponents would go to prison, then exchange for, in a negotiation with the European Union or the Western states about something else, or for the internal political gains. Sometimes even they would not go to jail and would target with other measures, targeting their businesses, their work, their relatives, all those tricks of the liberal legalism that is also very, very prominent for those regimes. And also a calculated violence. They had their security services and also some privately outsourced repression, like thugs for hire or other groups. But the violence they did, including against the political opponents, was very targeted. And it seemed that, you have this targeted paradigm, and it seems as an isolated instances. Of course, there was no accountability. No one ever got punished or accounted for that violence. But still, it was not mass scale. And now what we see following this huge public mobilization and the protest movement in Georgia, we see the emergence, and especially following Ivanishvili's threats, that the opponents of the regime and the enemy within will be dealt with decisively, what he said. We see the emergence of the mass-scale, both legal repression. There is a case, many activists have left the country because there are criminal cases against them for taking part into the protests. There are, thousands of misdemeanor charges. So in Georgian legal system, we don't, misdemeanor charges are called administrative offenses. So they are not crimes formally, but sometimes you can get in jail for a few days for administrative offense, for committing an administrative offense. And in many of the cases, you have to pay quite a considerable sum of fine. So it's you have thousands of cases now of those administrative offenses against the people participating in a protest. And in many cases, those are students and the people who have very precarious occupation and don't have even money to pay. You know, those 500 lari, 2,000 or 1,000 or 1,500 lari. You know, that's at least. That's at least few $100 if you convert it into dollars, those fines. And there are thousands of cases. You have a high mass-scale legal repression, both using the criminal law tools and administrative tools, and you have the mass-scale violence accelerated. You know, they announced that we are creating a database, an incriminating database of the enemies of the state. And following that, there is a huge coordinated campaign of calls. So people who are participating into those protests, and not only the political leaders or the prominent activists or NGO leaders or others, you know, even they are family members or just simple students who went to protest at the rallies, and their family members are getting phone calls with swearing, intimidation, threats of violence, threats of death, threats of rape, bodily injury, everything. And you have a huge and coordinated also campaign of major protest participants and the protest leaders. They are getting ambushed at their homes by thugs for hire, and they are beaten up. They are heavily beaten up, offended, swear that, beaten up. And another story, they are cornered if they come during the protest rallies. If they come close in the close physical proximity to the riot police and the police lines, then they are, we have the videos where it is seen that the security forces are having phones. So they are getting the photos of the select protesters whom to target. So they are getting instructions, they are targeting those people, they are cornering them, they are taking in, they are beating them up, severely beating them up. You have all those images, including the chairman of the major opposition party, United National Movement. You have other, prominent protest leaders who are hit, even in their faces. It's totally those are the disturbing images. How their eyes look, how their faces look. They are severely beaten. So
Davit, I must interject. I have to ask. This is a horrible story. Do you fear for your safety right now?
Yeah. Every time I go out, I'm followed. For example, for a long time now because of my opposition to this government from the start, and I'm in opposition since day one, because I was convinced since day one that they are Russian instruments. But in the recent years, I've been followed by the security service cars. The security service cars, they have these Skoda cars, which is the European brand. So and it's they are cars, the Skoda cars with the darkened glasses, so you cannot see through. Even the front glasses are darkened, you cannot see through, and something like this. So I'm followed every time, but this time they have spared me from the calls, and they have spared me also from ambushing. Why? because I have been devoting my efforts mostly to the international outreach. I was very active on Twitter. I was writing opinion pieces, appearing in the Western media, and they simply don't care what the West thinks about them. It is my opinion, because they have now committed, they are openly on the path of isolation from the West. They know that sanctions are coming and they are preparing themselves for that. They simply don't care. And the reason they don't target me this time, but of course they will target me later. The reason they are not targeting me this time is that I don't make speeches at the protest rallies. They target those people the first who are recognizable faces of the protest movement. That's why. Otherwise, yeah, I was one of the first actually to be targeted. I'm targeted actually by Ivanishvili's judicial elite, whom we call judicial clansmen, the guys who control judiciary on behalf of Ivanishvili. So it was actually one of the requirements of the European Union. Once they granted us the candidacy to membership, the European Commission made several requirements. One of that was de-oligarchization, basically freeing the captured state from the oligarchic influence. And they made some specific recommendations, and the specific recommendation was in terms of judiciary. So they said that now we see, and the civil society has explained to us, that you have captured judiciary through the corrupt and clientelistic judiciary elite. So why not make an extraordinary integrity checks, vetting of those judges, whether they are corrupt or not, whether they are compatible to hold those offices. And I now work at a think tank at the University of Georgia. We write policy papers in terms of the essential reforms, what we have to do in justice sector and in other sectors. I'm responsible for those justice sector reform papers, and one of those extensive research papers and policy paper based on the academic research and the policy paper and the reform proposal was how to do vetting of the judiciary. So, and that was pretty solid work, because vetting is a controversial issue. We have addressed it at length. How to make it compatible with human rights, how to make it compatible to sovereignty issues, how to make it compatible in a way, how to make it proof in a way that it does not get sabotaged by the corrupt judicial elites or other authoritarian elites. So there were strategies and like this. So the judges did not like it. So I was a subject of a coordinated campaign by the senior judges, chairman of the Court of Appeals, Supreme Court judges, senior judges at the Tbilisi City Court, all attacking me, saying that I'm a traitor, I'm a Soros agent, I represent the global war party, I want to undermine Georgia's sovereignty. Actually, Ivanishvili in his famous speech did not mention me personally, but mentioned vetting, the issue of judicial vetting, as an attempt of revolution. He said that the global party of war has attempted to instigate a revolution by requiring us to hold this extraordinary vetting, integrity checks of the judges, of those corrupt judicial elites. So yeah, there is. I face a risk of persecution. I'm targeted, and I work and function on a daily basis with the knowledge that I can be ambushed, or I can be subject to questioning or criminal investigation or any other measure they can come up with.
Davit, I want to say right now, and I mean this sincerely, if or when you actually do become a victim of this regime. You're already targeted. You made that clear. But if you actually become a victim, whether through being arrested or I hope not, beaten, and if you can, would you please contact me so I could bring this to the attention of my viewers, maybe talk about it with you, because this is absolutely horrible. My viewers, most of them, the ones in the United States anyway, and possibly throughout Europe, are not aware of the extent of the rot, and I'll call it rot, the Soviet rot, the corruption that's taking place right now in Georgia. And so if and when, God forbid, you do become a victim, would you please contact me so I can bring this to the attention of the international community that views my podcasts?
Absolutely. Yeah, I will, because it's the only way for us to, making ourselves loud and clear and making our truths be heard is the only weapon in us, because they describe us as violent. We are not violent. We are peaceful, freedom-loving, democratic people who really want to live under the rule of law. And they hate the rule of law. That's the thing they hate the most. They abuse it, they violate it, they do everything to defile it. And that's clear. Yeah, they hate the rule of law because they hate freedom. They don't like freedom because they are not themselves free. And that's the point.
I want to very shortly now get to your most recent article, but I have to ask this question, Davit. Even though it seems that the majority of Georgians want to join the EU and become more of a part of the Western world, why do so many Georgians seem to still support Russia and actually want to go back to life as it was under the Soviet Union?
So there is an apparent paradox in that you have these high approval ratings for European and Western integration, and also the regime support. The regime support is not yet directly translated to the open support of Russia. The regime knows that many of its supporters do not like Russia too. But, many of the regime supporters now are in a trap. In a trap because after those long years, the regime made them dependent on them. So they are dependent by their livelihood. They are dependent on the status quo. They are manipulated through emotionally. They are made emotionally dependent through propaganda, through manipulation, through the fear mongering, They portray that they are for the peace, and not only they, but it's the same with Orban in Hungary. They say that we are for peace, we want to avoid the war, and they play these fears of war, of losing everything, of what you have, of the precarity of losing your livelihood, and they manipulate so many people to cling to the status quo, this rotten status quo they have created, that only benefits to them, but they somehow manage to make those people dependent on them, at least part of them, to believe that they are also interested into keeping the status quo. Now we have this ongoing battle, this awakening and this social movement through the spontaneous protest mobilization is also reaching out to those people, trying to convince them that you are actually being manipulated. You are actually made dependent. The status quo is not as good as it seems for you. There is a better future for you if you risk coming with us, if you risk getting some of your freedom back, if you risk being free and against this regime, there won't be war, there will be European integration, there will be a movement to the freer society. You have the newer generation who is simply unable these protests are led by the younger generation. They are most vocal because they are simply unable to accept the ways of, the Soviet ways of this patronalism, hierarchy, freedom, repression, everything, And until now, the regime made some spaces for those younger generation. Yeah, they could go and work in business, in marketing, in creative industries. There were some social spaces where they could be for themselves, at least relatively. They did not have political power. They could not touch the regime's political power, but they were relatively let free, to pursue their own life choices. And now the regime has this sudden crackdown. They say that, no, we have to close up all those spaces because it's an existential threat to the regime. And once the regime comes with this crackdown, and these people also realize, the youth also realizes that this is also an existential moment for them. Because if those free spaces are conclusively and finally abolished, then they are left with nothing. It's a brutal force. And there is this huge realization. The young people are those who see this most clearly. Some people in the middle, it's still difficult, to communicate to them. It's not that clear-cut generational change. There are many people who fought against the Soviet rule and who are still fighting. There are many people whose entire life was fighting against
the Georgian regime right now is just, taking the playbook out of authoritarianism 101, which is planting the seeds of fear into the heart of the public, making this an existential argument that it's either us or this country will cease to exist. When, of course, that's nonsense. But they plant these seeds of fear. Davit, I'm sure you're aware that we in the United States are going through a similar struggle now on a much larger scale with the MAGA movement, the Republican Party, and Donald Trump. We literally are on the verge of losing our democracy on a much, much larger and a historic event or scale because of that exact authoritarianism playbook of planting the seeds of fear and telling people, if you don't support us, your life is over. This country will cease to exist. And of all things, democracy will end, when, of course, they are the antithesis of democracy. Davit, the title of your article starts with the words Stalin's return. Why did you choose those particular words right now?
Well, because as I mentioned, there is a ongoing authoritarian consolidation, which, as you rightly mentioned, follows this authoritarianism 101. The standard techniques, including the prominently used mass-scale repression, both legal and violent. But there is a distinction of combination of those authoritarian repression techniques with totalitarian practices, and with the totalitarian practices reminiscent of Stalinism. And those are the practices that are actually now systemically resurrected in Russia and in Belarus. And what are those totalitarian practices like? Which are directed not only at the physical person or the legal person, or neutralizing person's physical resistance by simply locking him up, or neutralizing person legally. That's a standard authoritarian technique. But totalitarianism and totalitarian practice aspires even more. It aspires to destroy moral person in man. So it's basically annihilating a man as a moral subject. So those practices are like those mass-scale terrorizing their family members, trying, to impose, for example, this foreign agents bill. In the last reading, they have introduced the amendment which authorizes them, under the monitoring powers of the foreign agents, to request from not only from organizations, but all the people, all the natural persons related to those organizations, all data, all personal data, including the strictly classified, strictly privileged personal data, like your political beliefs, your religious beliefs, your sexual life, your health data, everything. That's an instrument of totalitarian control, They say it's about transparency. It's a transparency in a perverted sense, in a totalitarian sense of the term, because the totalitarian aim is to make everyone transparent before the power. You lose everything. You are transformed into an object of totalitarian domination. Then those who have the total dominion over you know everything about you. That's what they aspire to know. For example, now they will have the legal powers to ask you the questions. For example, you worked for a religious charity, foreign religious charity. Tell me, please, what are your religious beliefs? If you don't tell them, they will fine you. And make no mistake, this legislation will get draconian. Now the fine is 5,000 laris, around $2,000. But the fines will get bigger. It will get a criminal offense not to disclose. They will accelerate, and there will be also a criminal responsibility, like it happens in Russia. It goes down the road very fast.
So you believe the foreign agent law will become even worse in the near future? More
yes, absolutely.
Restrictive. Okay.
Absolutely, like it was in Russia, but in Russia it took like a decade to reach at this point, and now it took like one hearing for them to add even more totalitarian tool, like a mandate to get all personal information about you. So that's what I'm sure that their next step is basically adding all the restrictions of the foreign agent laws from Russia, including the restriction of the electoral rights, and they will use this law for the election manipulation and election integrity, because they are aiming to close or make their operation impossible, the election monitoring organizations. Also what they are doing now, they did the legislative changing, basically capturing the election administration. There is this one central election administration who certifies the results of the elections. So now they have changed the law, saying that the Central Election Commission can adopt the final act or any other decision which requires a qualified majority, 2/3 majority, by simple majority.
Well, the old Soviet expression, it's not who wins the election, it's who counts the votes.
Yeah.
So,
that's what they are trying to do, yes.
Well, as you're well aware, Davit, at least as much as I am, if not more, in Putin's Russia, the severe draconian repression that he has exercised on the Russian people has all but killed, snuffed out, flattened any opposition in Russia. It's virtually impossible right now. with the new foreign agent law, and if what you say comes true, that it's going to become even more repressive, do you see any chance that an opposition party or just demonstrations in the streets like we're seeing now could have any chance of success in rolling some of this back?
There is a chance, but the chances are slim, because
or will it become like Russia is today?
There is if the regime's consolidation is pretty solid, and instead we don't have institutional ways left. The only institutional way is elections, but we have to fight to keep that institution alive, to ensure its basic integrity. We still have to fight for that. And the regime has expressed its readiness basically for a violent crackdown if there is a huge protest following the electoral fraud. So that here comes my comparison with Belarusian scenario. Their readiness basically to stay power by electoral fraud and crackdown on the mass protests against the fraudulent elections. Now, if this materializes, then comes the relative calculus whether the protest mobilization could exhaust the resources of the security services and the other resources of the regime. Yeah, and that's a very tricky story, because sometimes the spontaneous popular mobilization can achieve that, and sometimes it can't. We are in a better position in many ways compared to Belarus, because we did not have until now, we did have some democracy. We still have a civil society, of course, which is threatened, which is sidelined now, and which is, threatened with extinction, but still, we still have that civil society. We are not yet as atomized following the repression as they were in Belarus. There are still ties of social solidarity, some social civil society infrastructure, in terms of organization, in terms of the social capital, in terms of solidarity. So there are resources. Of course, this gives us a better position, for example, than Belarusian civil society or Russian even civil society to resist, to mount an effective resistance. But we don't have a guarantee of success, because on the other hand, we have a regime who is highly consolidated, highly personified. We have the security services which are loyal, disciplined, coup-proof, and highly loyal to the leader. So yes, those are the factors that can help the regime, and they have the strong external patron in Russia. So Russia could be, even though Russia has limited resources for the military intervention or the large scale personal direct intervention, it still has considerable resources, with the know-how, with other resources to help the regime in controlling, including this mass protest mobilization. So we are really at the point where, this can go either way. There are chances of success for the civil society, but those chances are sometimes exaggerated, because the regime has the formidable resources, and it can do many. It has many things in its power to consolidate. So we have to, of course, there is no other way but to resist. The resistance is not the only way. But we have to be aware that this resistance may fail, but nevertheless, we should resist with an aim to succeed. But we should watch closely, because this entire situation can unfold in many unpredictable ways.
Well, that leads to my next to the last question. In a recent edition of the publication New Eastern Europe, they have an article titled that Georgia has now reached a crucial moment. I think you've pretty much laid that out. It seems that if Georgia right now is at a tipping point, an inflection point, where if it goes one way or the other, you're very liable to lose your democracy, maybe as early as this year. How much of an existential danger to Georgian democracy are current events right now?
Yes, this is not only an existential danger, but a materialized existential danger. Yeah, we have a regime which has fully exposed itself as a personalist, personified and consolidated power around a personalist leader who is aligning himself with the regional autocracies like Russia and China, and isolating from the free and himself from the free and democratic world. And these are already facts. The facts also say that, yes, to a great extent, this danger has already materialized. And now we are ex post facto, after the fact, responding, fighting back, to avert and to undo this. So many bad things in terms of losing our democracy has already happened. It materialized. We have almost lost it. We don't have it, and we are fighting our last battle of reclaiming it. So there is a chance of reclaiming it, but if we lose this war, it's lost. So that's how the realistic explanation of the situation is this: that we have already lost, but not without a last chance, the last fight. So now we have this last fight for it, and if we succeed, we can turn things back, and we can get back to the democratic tracks, and we can go even push further for the democratic consolidation of liberal democracy. But if we lose this, I don't see for decades, this pace of freedom and democracy for this place will be forever closed. So this is to communicate the entire gravity of the situation and of the battle we are in.
Let me just say, Davit, that I'll be brutally honest with you. I'm very, very disappointed, disgusted, to be honest, at the lack of action that NATO, and including the United States, has taken in support of Georgia. And I mean economically, diplomatically, and yes, even militarily. If things don't go right, if they go even worse this year, we meaning the West, very possibly could lose another nation to an authoritarian regime. This could very well just spin out into the Russian orbit. And that would be a disaster. And it is, in my opinion, preventable. But NATO, like they are actually in Ukraine, but that's a whole other issue, are not taking the steps to defeat Russia, to protect a country that desperately wants to become part of the West, part of the EU.
But let's hope that there are signs that the policy is shifting in Washington. It's a last minute, maybe it won't help, but it's still good to observe that there are signs that there might be help, like the introduction of this new act regarding the sanctions, and also giving the regime new opportunities. Of course, knowing that this regime would not accept it, but a window for the following the democratic, if the democratic forces succeed, it's a good sign that the United States realizes that in order to keep Georgia, it needs to do a lot more in terms of trade, security, and all other bilateral ties. So let's hope for the better. But I share this disappointment. There is a share of Western inaction that led us here. It has also there are some objective factors. There are some unexcusable factors that can, but that's wholly another story. Yeah.
Davit Zedeslashvili, thank you for joining me today on the No Delusion Zone. Please take care and stay safe.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you for your support. Thanks. Bye.
My pleasure. Thank you for watching this edition of the No Delusion Zone. And remember, anyone can have their own delusions, but they can't have their own facts. Take care, stay safe, and stay sane.